In a world where your worth is decided before you take your first breath, one girl learned that invisibility was safer than hope. Liv existed at the bottom of the bottom, a slave among slaves, the daughter of violence no one wanted to remember. For 19 winters, she scrubbed floors on her knees and slept in corners no one else wanted, watching life happen around her like she was already a ghost. Until the day a broken warrior stumbled through the door, carrying shame heavier than any sword, and their eyes met across a room that had never seen either of them before. What happens when two people the world has thrown away decide they're worth fighting for? When a disgraced son of a jarl looks at a nameless slave and sees something everyone else missed? In the brutal world of the Vikings, where honor means everything and mercy means nothing, one impossible choice will tear apart a family, shatter an alliance, and force two outcasts to answer a question that could cost them their lives. How much would you risk for someone the world says is worthless? And what if that someone was you? Liv learned early that even among slaves there were hierarchies, and she existed at the very bottom. The other thralls whispered when she passed, not because she was different, but because she was nothing. No father to claim her, no tribe to mourn her mother's capture, not even a story worth telling around the fire. Just the result of violence no one wanted to remember, born into chains before she took her first breath. This morning she woke to find her sleeping corner in the barn had been taken by the new thrall, a woman captured from a coastal raid 3 weeks ago. The woman still had the haunted look of someone who remembered freedom, but even she felt entitled to push Liv aside. No one protested. Liv gathered her thin blanket without a word, her fingers numb from the cold that seeped through the wooden walls, and found another corner near the goats. At least the animals didn't judge her worth. The frost clung to everything as she stepped outside, the fjord stretching gray and endless beyond the village. Her breath came out in white clouds that disappeared as quickly as her presence in any room. 19 winters she had survived, and sometimes she wondered why she bothered. The thought came often lately, especially on mornings like this when her body ached from sleeping on frozen ground and her stomach cramped from yesterday's single meal of stale bread. She headed toward the main longhouse where Jarl Thorstein held court. Her hands were already cracked and bleeding from the lye soap she used to scrub his family's floors, but complaining meant punishment. The path crunched beneath her worn shoes, leather so thin she felt every stone through the sole. Other thralls passed her without acknowledgement. The free folk didn't even see her. Inside the longhouse, smoke from the central fire stung her eyes. The Jarl sat in his high seat, his presence filling the room like the smoke itself, thick and suffocating. His wife, Helga, stood nearby, her posture rigid with the kind of dignity Liv would never know. Their oldest son, Bjorn, sharpened his blade by the fire, the scraping sound setting Liv's teeth on edge. "You." Helga's voice cut through the morning din. "The floor near the sleeping quarters. There's mud tracked everywhere." Liv nodded, keeping her eyes down. Speaking was dangerous. Thralls who spoke too much found themselves on the wrong end of a beating. Or worse, sold to traders who took slaves to places where winters killed the weak within months. She knelt on the cold stone floor, her knees protesting immediately. The bucket of water beside her had a thin layer of ice on top that she broke with her raw fingers. The shock of cold water made her gasp, but she swallowed the sound. Show nothing. Feel nothing. Survive. The door burst open with a violence that made everyone turn. Halfdan stumbled in, and the change in him stole the air from the room. 3 months ago, he had left for his first major raid, desperate to prove himself after years of being called soft, too thoughtful for a warrior's life. Now he stood in the doorway like a ghost wearing his skin. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt beneath a poorly healed scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. But worse than the physical wounds was something broken in the way he held himself, shoulders curved inward as if trying to make himself smaller. "Father." His voice cracked on. The word. Jarl Thorstein stood slowly, his face unreadable. "You return alone. The others, we were ambushed 2 days from the coast." Halfdan's hands trembled. I survived. The weight of that last word hung in the air like an accusation. In Viking society, surviving when your companions died was not always seen as fortune. Sometimes it was seen as cowardice. Bjorn's blade stopped its scraping. You ran. I fought. But even Liv, invisible in her corner, could hear the uncertainty in Halfdan's voice. I tried to. You tried. Torstein's voice was ice. Your brother died with honor. You tried. Liv's hand stilled in the water. She had never heard the Jarl speak with such contempt. Even to thralls, he was coldly formal, but this was different. This was a father looking at his son and finding him worthless. Halfdan's eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Liv. For just a moment, she saw something in his gaze that she recognized, the look of someone who had become invisible to the people who should see them most. Then his mother moved forward, and whatever connection Liv imagined shattered. You need food. Rest. We will speak of this later. But everyone in that room knew there was nothing to speak about. Halfdan had returned bearing shame instead of glory, and in their world, shame was a stain that spread like blood on snow. Liv returned to her scrubbing, but her hands moved automatically now. She watched from the corner of her eye as Halfdan was led away, his steps uncertain, his back bent under the weight of disappointment that radiated from his family like winter cold. She recognized that walk. It was the walk of someone who had just learned they were worth less than they believed. As the longhouse slowly returned to its morning rhythms, Liv wrung out her rag and moved to the next section of floor. Her knees screamed in protest. Her fingers had gone beyond pain into numbness. But she had learned long ago that physical suffering was easier than the other kind. The kind that came from knowing that even if she scrubbed these floors for 50 more winters, she would still be nothing more than the girl no one wanted. She didn't know then that the broken young man who had stumbled through that door would change everything. That his shame and her invisibility would collide in ways that would force them both to answer an impossible question. What was a life worth? And who got to decide? 3 days passed before Liv saw Halfdan again, and when she did, she wished she hadn't. He sat alone behind the longhouse where they kept the woodpile, his back against the rough timber, staring at nothing. The morning sun cut harsh shadows across his face, making the scar look deeper, angrier. In his hands, he held a knife, turning it over and over, the blade catching light with each rotation. Something about the mechanical way he moved made Liv's stomach tighten with unease. She should have walked past. Thralls who involved themselves in the business of free folk, especially the Jarl's family, invited trouble that could end in scars or worse. But her feet slowed, then stopped. Maybe it was the way he held that knife. Maybe it was the recognition of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether to step back or jump. The Jarl wants more firewood brought inside, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Halfdan didn't look up. Then get it. His tone wasn't cruel, just empty. Somehow that was worse. Liv moved toward the woodpile, her movements careful, deliberate. She could feel his eyes on her now, though she didn't turn to confirm it. You're the one they don't even name, he said suddenly. Heat flooded her face, shame mixing with something sharper. Even broken, even outcast by his own family, he still had the luxury of noticing her only to point out her worthlessness. I have a name, she said, and immediately regretted speaking. Thralls didn't correct free folk. They especially didn't correct the Jarl's son. What is it? The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in months, maybe years. People called her you, or girl, or nothing at all. Her name existed only in her own head, repeated silently like a prayer to remind herself she was real. Liv. Liv. He said it slowly, as if testing the weight of it. Life. Strange name for someone treated like they're already dead. She should have gathered the wood and left. Instead, she found herself turning to face him, her arms full of split logs, bark biting into her already damaged skin. Strange observation from someone who looks like he wishes he were. The words escaped before she could stop them. Horror flooded through her immediately. She had just told the Jarl's son that he looked suicidal. Thralls were beaten for less, killed for less. But Halfdan didn't explode in anger. He laughed. It was a broken, bitter sound that held no joy, but it was laughter nonetheless. "You're right," he said, setting the knife down. Beside him, everyone else tiptoes around it. My mother brings food I don't eat. My father won't look at me. Bjorn sharpens his weapons louder when I'm in the room, making sure I remember what a real warrior sounds like. But you just say it. Liv's heart hammered against her ribs. This felt dangerous in a different way than punishment. This felt like the moment before ice breaks beneath your feet. "I should go," she managed. "Wait." He stood, and she instinctively stepped back, logs falling from her arms to scatter across the frozen ground. But he didn't move toward her. He just stood there, looking more lost than any person she had ever seen. What's it like, being invisible? The question stripped her bare. No one had ever asked her that. No one acknowledged her existence enough to wonder about her experience of it. She bent to gather the fallen wood, needing something to do with her hands. It's like being a ghost. You see everything, hear everything, but no one sees you. Back. After a while, you start to wonder if you're real at all. When she straightened, he was closer. Not threatening, just present in a way that made her aware of how rarely anyone stood this close to her without violence following. "I know that feeling now," he said quietly. 3 months ago, I was the Jarl's son. Not the favorite, but still his blood. Still worth something. Now I walk into rooms and watch them wish I hadn't come back. Watch them calculate how much shame I've brought them. My brother died with his sword in his hand, and his voice cracked. I lived by hiding behind a rock while they were slaughtered. Liv didn't know what to say. Comfort wasn't her place to give, but something in her chest ached at the raw pain in his voice. "You survived," she offered. "That takes its own kind of courage." "No." The word came out sharp. "Survival isn't courage when everyone you care about dies. It's just cowardice with a pulse." He turned away from her then, facing the fjord that stretched cold and gray beyond the village. His shoulders shook once, then went rigid with control. Liv recognized that too. The fight to keep pain locked inside where no one could see it and use it against you. She should leave. Every instinct screamed at her to take the wood and go before someone saw them talking. Before Astrid or the Jarl or anyone else decided this conversation meant something it didn't. But instead, she heard herself say, "I think about it sometimes. Dying. Whether anyone would notice if I just stopped waking up one morning." Halfdan turned back to her, something shifting in his hollow eyes. "And?" he asked. "And I keep waking up anyway. Not because I'm brave. Not because I have hope. But because maybe tomorrow will be the day someone sees me. Really sees me." She swallowed hard. Stupid, probably. But it's enough to keep going. The silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sound of waves and the cry of gulls. When Halfdan finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter but somehow more solid. "Someone sees you now." 4 words, simple, devastating. Liv felt something crack open in her chest, something she had kept sealed for 19 years because hope was more dangerous than despair. Hope made you vulnerable. Hope made you care. Before she could respond, voices drifted from around the longhouse. Astrid's laugh, bright and sharp as a blade. The sound of her father's men. Halfdan's face closed off immediately. He stepped back, putting proper distance between them, becoming once again the disgraced son who shouldn't be caught speaking with a thrall. But as Liv gathered the wood with shaking hands and hurried away, she carried those 4 words with her like a dangerous secret. Someone sees you now. She didn't know yet that being seen could be more terrifying than being invisible. That once you were seen, you could be targeted, destroyed, used as a weapon against the person who dared to look. Astrid arrived like winter. Itself, beautiful and deadly, wrapped in furs that cost more than Liv would earn in 10 lifetimes of servitude. Liv was scrubbing the stone steps leading to the longhouse when the procession entered the village. 6 warriors on horseback, 2 servants, and at the center, Astrid herself, sitting tall in her saddle with the confidence of someone who had never questioned her value. Her blonde hair was intricately braided with silver threads woven through each plait, catching the weak afternoon sun. Even from a distance, Liv could see the calculation in her ice-blue eyes as they swept across the village, taking inventory of everything that would soon belong to her. The betrothal had been arranged 2 years ago, back when Halfdan was still whole, still someone worth binding to another powerful family. Now, watching Astrid dismount with practiced grace, Liv wondered if anyone had told her what she was actually riding into. A family fractured by shame. A promised husband who could barely meet. His own reflection. "You there?" Astrid's voice cut through the cold air like a whip crack. "Fetch my belongings, carefully. Some of those chests contain items worth more than your life." Liv set down her brush and moved toward the horses, keeping her eyes lowered. But she felt Astrid's gaze follow her, assessing, dismissing, forgetting her in the span of a heartbeat. That was how it always went. Invisible until someone needed something, then invisible again the moment the task was complete. Inside the longhouse, the Jarl had arranged a feast to welcome his future daughter-in-law. The main table groaned under the weight of roasted meat, fresh bread, mead, and decorated horns. Liv worked in the shadows, refilling cups and clearing plates, her presence acknowledged only when someone thrust an empty vessel in her direction without looking. Halfdan sat at the table like a man at his own funeral. He wore clean clothes, his hair had been combed back, but nothing could hide the deadness in his eyes. When Astrid spoke to him, he answered in single words, his gaze fixed on his untouched plate. "I hear your raid encountered difficulties," Astrid said, her tone sympathetic in a way that felt rehearsed. "These things happen. My own brother lost 3 ships to a storm last spring. Fortune is fickle." The comparison was absurd. A storm was an act of the gods, unavoidable, blameless. An ambush that you survived while your companions died was something else entirely. Everyone at the table heard the false equivalents, including Astrid herself. She knew exactly what she was doing. Bjorn leaned forward, his expression dark. "Our brother didn't die in a storm. He died because someone failed to hold the line." The tension in the room thickened like smoke. Liv was refilling Helga's cup when it happened, and she felt the Jarl's wife go rigid beneath her hands. "That's enough," Torstein said, but his voice lacked conviction. He didn't defend Halfdan, didn't contradict Bjorn's accusation. The silence that followed was its own kind of verdict. Astrid reached across the table to place her hand over Halfdan's. "I'm sure you fought bravely, and now you're home. That's what matters." Halfdan pulled his hand away as if her touch burned. For just a moment, his eyes lifted from his plate and found Liv across the room. The look lasted less than a heartbeat, but something passed between them. Recognition, understanding. 2 people drowning in separate seas, catching sight of each other. Before the waves closed over their heads again, Astrid noticed. Liv saw the exact moment those calculating eyes followed Halfdan's gaze and landed on her. The assessment was instant and brutal. A thrall, not even a pretty one. No threat. But Astrid's smile tightened at the corners, just slightly. She was a woman who noticed everything, forgot nothing, and filed away each detail for future use. Later, after the feast had dissolved into drinking and stories, Liv was carrying scraps to the pig pen. When she heard voices behind the storage shed, she should have announced herself, made noise, given them warning. Instead, she froze. "You embarrassed me tonight." Astrid's voice was cold, controlled. "Pulling away from me in front of your family like I carried disease." "I didn't mean to embarrass you." Halfdan sounded exhausted, like even this conversation required more energy than he possessed. "I just can't pretend everything is normal." "Normal?" Astrid laughed, and there was something sharp in it. "Nothing about this is normal. I was promised to the second son of a Jarl, a man with prospects and honor. Instead, I arrived to find a ghost wearing his face, a family drowning in shame, and a betrothal that now benefits me nothing." Then leave, Halfdan said, and Liv heard something new in his voice. Not anger, but something harder. Finality. Tell your father the match is unsuitable. I won't fight it. The silence stretched so long that Liv thought the conversation had ended. She was preparing to slip away when Astrid spoke again, and this time her voice carried a different quality. Dangerous. You think I spent 2 years preparing to become a Jarl's wife only to return home empty-handed? To face my father's disappointment? My mother's pity? Her voice dropped lower. No. We will marry as planned. You will learn to play your part, to at least pretend to be the man I was promised. And if you can't manage that, I will make sure everyone knows that the failure of this union rests entirely on your shoulders. They already blame me for everything, Halfdan said quietly. One more failure won't matter. Won't it? Astrid moved closer. Liv could hear it in the way her voice shifted position. What about her? The thrall you keep looking at like she holds answers to questions you haven't asked yet. Liv's blood turned to ice. I don't know what you're talking about. Please. Astrid's laugh was cutting. I've spent my whole life reading people. It's how women survive. In this world, you look at that slave the way drowning men look at distant shores, like she represents something you've lost. A pause. It's pathetic, really, but also useful. Don't. Halfdan's voice held warning now. She has nothing to do with any of this. Exactly, she's nothing. No family, no protection, no value beyond the work her hands can do, which means she's the perfect pressure point. Astrid's voice turned sweet, poisonous. Behave as a proper betrothed should, Halfdan, or I'll... Make sure your father understands that the thrall has been distracting you from your duties, that she's been insolent, lazy, stealing, perhaps. He wouldn't believe you, wouldn't he? Astrid's footsteps moved away. Your father is looking for someone to blame for his son's failures. Right now, that someone is you. How much effort would it take to redirect that anger toward someone even more powerless? Liv stood frozen behind the storage shed, the bucket of scraps forgotten in her hands. Her breath came in short, painful gasps that she fought to keep silent. This was what being seen meant. This was the price of that moment when Halfdan's eyes had found hers across the longhouse. She had been noticed, and now she could be used as a weapon. Liv became a shadow of a shadow, moving through the longhouse like smoke, trying to make herself even more invisible than before. For 5 days, she avoided every space where Halfdan might be, kept her eyes locked on the ground, spoke only when directly addressed. Fear had become her constant companion, sitting heavy in her chest like a stone. But invisibility was a skill that only worked when people chose not to see you, and Astrid had decided to look. It started small, a cup of mead knocked over near where Liv was working, the liquid soaking into fresh rushes she had just laid. Astrid's voice, sweet with false concern. Oh, how clumsy of me. You'll need to replace those, won't you? Then a serving platter that Astrid claimed was still dirty, even though Liv had scrubbed it until her knuckles bled. Really, does this household not train their thralls properly? In my father's hall, this would earn a beating. Each incident was small, deniable, but they accumulated like stones in a cairn, building toward something Liv couldn't yet see but could feel approaching like storm clouds on the horizon. On the 6th day, Liv was drawing water from the well when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Halfdan standing there, and the shock of seeing him up close again made her nearly drop the bucket. He looked worse than before. His eyes were hollowed out from lack of sleep, and there was a new tension in the way he held himself, like a man expecting a blow. You've been avoiding me, he said quietly. Liv glanced around frantically. They were alone for the moment, but anyone could appear at any second. I'm doing my work, nothing more. That's not what I asked. She turned back to the well, focusing on the rope in her hands, the weight of the bucket, anything but the ache in her chest at the hurt in his voice. Your betrothed made it clear that we shouldn't speak. I'm following her wishes. Since when do you follow Astrid's wishes? Since she has the power to destroy me with a single word. The truth came out harder than she intended. You don't understand what it's like. You're still the Jarl's son, no matter how much shame you carry. You still have protection, position, a future. I have nothing. If she decides I'm a problem, I disappear. Halfdan stepped closer, and she could feel the heat of him despite the cold morning air. I won't let her hurt you. The words should have brought comfort. Instead, they terrified her. You can't promise that. You can barely protect yourself right now. He flinched as if she had struck him, and immediately she regretted her bluntness. But it was true, and they both knew it. Halfdan had no power here anymore. He was barely tolerated by his own family. One mistake away from being cast out entirely. I'm sorry, she said softly. But please, don't make this harder than it already is. Don't look at me. Don't speak to me. Let me fade back into the walls where I belong. She picked up the bucket and started walking, but his voice stopped her. What if I don't want you to fade? The question hung in the frozen air between them. Liv closed her eyes, fighting against the dangerous warmth spreading through her chest. Then you're a fool, and we'll both pay for your foolishness. She left him standing by the well, but she felt his gaze on her back like a brand. That afternoon, the Jarl called a meeting in the main hall. All the free folk of the household were required to attend, and thralls served mead while Thorstein discussed plans for the coming season. Liv moved between the benches, refilling horns, trying to be as unremarkable as possible. She was passing behind Astrid when it happened. The bride-to-be stood suddenly, and Liv, trying to avoid collision, jerked backward. The pitcher in her hands tilted and mead splashed across the floor. Not on Astrid, not on anyone, just on the ground. But Astrid whirled around, her face a perfect mask of shock and outrage. You clumsy creature! Her voice rang through the hall, cutting through every conversation. You nearly soaked me. Liv's heart stopped. I didn't. I was just... Don't lie to me. Astrid's voice rose higher. I felt the liquid splash my dress. Look, there. She gestured to her skirt where a few drops of mead had landed, so small they were barely visible. This dress is worth more than you'll earn in your lifetime, and you've ruined it. Every eye in the hall turned toward them. Liv felt her face burn, her hands shaking so badly that more mead sloshed from the pitcher. I'm sorry, I didn't mean. Of course you didn't mean to. Astrid's voice dripped with false patience. But intention doesn't matter when the damage is done, does it? Thorstein stood from his seat, his face dark with displeasure. What is the meaning of this disruption? This thrall has destroyed my dress, Astrid said, her voice trembling with just the right amount of injured dignity. And when I confronted her, she lied about it. I saw it happen. She was careless, and now she tries to escape responsibility. Liv wanted to defend herself, to explain what actually happened, but thralls who argued with free folk only made things worse. Her throat closed around the words that might have saved her. Is this true? Thorstein demanded, looking at Liv with the same cold assessment he might give a broken tool. Before Liv could speak, another voice cut through the hall. No, it's not. Halfdan stood from his bench, and the shock that rippled through the room was almost physical. He had barely spoken in days, and now he was openly contradicting his betrothed in front of everyone. I was watching, he continued, his voice steady despite the tremor Liv could see in his hands. The thrall moved to avoid my lady Astrid. A few drops spilled on the floor. Nothing more. Astrid's eyes narrowed dangerously. Are you calling me a liar, husband-to-be? The title was a weapon, a reminder of what he owed her, what he risked by defying her. I'm telling the truth as I saw it, Halfdan said. The girl did nothing wrong. The silence in the hall was suffocating. Liv felt dizzy, her vision tunneling as she realized what Halfdan had just done. He had put himself between her and Astrid's anger. He had made himself a target to shield someone who was supposed to be beneath his notice. Thorstein's jaw tightened. My son seems to have a peculiar interest in the well-being of thralls lately. The implication in those words was clear. Inappropriate interest, shameful interest, the kind that brought more dishonor to a family that had already suffered enough. Bjorn laughed from his seat, the sound cruel. Perhaps our brother finds slaves more suitable company than warriors. They certainly don't expect courage. Halfdan's face went white, but he didn't back down. I expect truth, brother. That's all. Astrid stepped closer to Halfdan, her voice dropping to a whisper that still carried through the now silent hall. This is the hill you choose to die on, defending a thrall's honor. Someone's honor needs defending, Halfdan said quietly. And it isn't yours. The world seemed to stop breathing. Astrid's face transformed, the mask of injured dignity cracking to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. She looked at Halfdan like she was seeing him clearly for the first time, measuring him, finding him wanting, and deciding exactly how to destroy him. I see, she said softly, each word precise as a blade. I understand now. She turned to face Torstein, her posture shifting into something demure, wounded. My Lord Jarl, I must speak plainly, though it pains me. I came here in good faith to honor a betrothal made in better times. I have tried to be patient with your son's condition, to understand his struggles. But I will not be insulted in front of your household. I will not have my word questioned while he defends a slave as if she were a noble woman. Torstein's expression was unreadable, but Liev saw his knuckles whiten around his mead horn. Halfdan, sit down. No. Halfdan's voice was quiet but firm. I won't watch someone be punished for something they didn't do. You embarrass yourself, his father said, and the disappointment in those words was heavier than any shout. You embarrass this family. Again. The again hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Helga stood from her seat, her face pale. Halfdan, please, think about what you're doing. I am thinking, Mother, maybe for the first time since I came home. He looked around the hall, at all the faces watching him with varying degrees of disgust, pity, or fascination. I've spent weeks drowning in shame, letting you all look at me like I'm broken, believing I am. Broken. But watching you all tear apart someone who has no voice, no defense, no power. He shook his head. That's what's actually shameful. Bjorn stood now too, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. Careful, brother. You're speaking like a man who's lost his mind along with his courage. Maybe I have, Halfdan said, and there was something almost like freedom in his voice. Maybe that's what it takes to see clearly. To see how we treat people who can't fight back. To see how power makes us cruel and call it tradition. Liv wanted to scream at him to stop, to sit down, to save himself. Every word he spoke dug his grave deeper. But she stood frozen, the pitcher still clutched in her trembling hands, watching him sacrifice himself for her, and knowing she could do nothing to prevent it. Astrid moved closer to Torstein, her voice dropping to something that carried the weight of threat beneath its sweetness. My lord, I must consider carefully whether this union serves either of our families. My father expected me to marry a man of honor and stability. Instead, I find... She gestured at Halfdan with something close to contempt. This. A man more concerned with slaves than his own reputation. The message was clear. Continue to defend Liv, and Astrid would break the betrothal. The alliance between the families would shatter. Torstein would lose valuable connections, trade agreements, military support. All because his disgraced son couldn't keep his mouth shut about a worthless thrall. Torstein stood slowly, and the authority in that movement made everyone else fall silent. Halfdan, my chambers, now. Father, Now! Halfdan's jaw clenched, but he followed his father from the hall. As they left, Liev saw the way his hands shook at his sides, the way his shoulders curved inward, as if bracing for a blow. He had stood up for her, and now he would pay the price. Astrid turned her attention back to Liv, and the smile she wore was victorious. Clean up this mess, thrall, and consider yourself fortunate that my husband-to-be has such a soft heart, though I suspect that softness will be corrected very soon. The hall gradually returned to its previous noise level, conversations resuming, mead flowing again. But Liv felt like she was moving underwater, everything muffled and slow. She knelt to clean the spilled mead, her hands moving automatically while her mind raced with terror and guilt. She had done this by existing, by being noticed, by accepting those 4 words from Halfdan days ago. Someone sees you now. She had set this catastrophe in motion. One of the older thralls, a woman named Inga, who rarely spoke, knelt beside her with another rag. "Stupid boy," she whispered, so quietly only Liv could hear. "Brave and stupid. That's a dangerous combination." "I didn't ask him to." "Doesn't matter what you asked," Inga interrupted, her weathered hands working efficiently. "He chose to see you, and now you're both marked." She glanced toward the door where Halfdan and his father had disappeared. "Question is, what happens next?" Liv didn't have an answer. She just knew that somewhere in the Jarl's private chambers, Halfdan was being torn apart for defending her, and there was nothing she could do except kneel on the cold floor and scrub up mead that Astrid had used as a weapon. Hours later, after the household had settled for the night and Liv was finally alone in her corner of the barn, she heard footsteps approaching. Terror spiked through her, visions of punishment finally arriving, of Astrid's threats becoming reality. But it was Halfdan who appeared in the doorway, backlit by moonlight. His face was bruised, one eye swelling shut, and he moved like every step hurt. His father hadn't just yelled at him, he had beaten him, something that hadn't happened since Halfdan was a child. "You shouldn't be here," Liv whispered, scrambling to her feet. "I know." He leaned against the door frame, and she could see him fighting to stay upright. "I just needed you to know. What happened today wasn't your fault." "Of course it was my fault. You defended me, and now I finally feel like myself again," he interrupted. "These past months, I've been a ghost, walking around dead inside because I survived when better men didn't. But today, standing up for you, that was the first time since the raid that I felt alive, that I felt like someone worth being." Tears burned in Liv's eyes. "You're a fool." "Probably." He smiled, and even through the bruises, there was something genuine in it. "But I'm a fool who's tired of letting fear decide everything. Tired of staying silent while people with power destroy people without it. Your father will disown you. Astrid will break the betrothal. You'll lose everything." "I already lost everything that mattered," Halfdan said quietly. "My brother, my honor, my sense of who I was. What's left to lose?" "Your life," Liv said desperately. "Your life still matters." He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his battered face. "So does yours, Liv. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Your life matters just as much as mine, as Astrid's, as my father's. And if no one else in this God's-forsaken place will say it, then I will." He turned to leave, each step clearly painful, and Liv felt something break open inside her chest. Something that felt like hope and terror tangled together so tightly she couldn't separate them. "Halfdan," she called softly, and he paused. "Thank you." He nodded once, then disappeared into the darkness, leaving Liv alone with the terrifying knowledge that someone had finally seen her, truly seen her, and the cost of that visibility might destroy them both. The summons came 3 days later, delivered by a grim-faced warrior who found Liv hauling water from the well. "You're wanted at the Thing, immediately." The Thing, the assembly where free folk gathered to settle disputes, pass judgment, decide the fates of those accused. Thralls were only called to the Thing for one reason: they had been accused of a crime. Liv's legs nearly gave out beneath her. The bucket slipped from her fingers, water spilling across the frozen ground. What crime? But the warrior had already turned away, expecting her to follow. She did, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. What had Astrid accused her of? Theft? Insolence? Attempting to seduce a free man? The Thing was held in an open space near the center of the village, surrounded by posts carved with symbols of the gods. Already a crowd had gathered, far more people than a simple thrall's trial should warrant. This was entertainment, A spectacle. At the center of the assembly stood Jarl Torstein in his high seat, flanked by other respected men of the community. Astrid stood to one side, her face composed into perfect grief and outrage. And there, bound with rope around his wrists, stood Halfdan. The sight of him tied like a common criminal drove the air from Liv's lungs. His face was still bruised from his father's beating, but now there was something else there too. Resignation mixed with defiance, like a man who had accepted his fate but refused to bow before it. "Bring the thrall forward," Torstein commanded, his voice carrying across the assembly. Liv was pushed toward the center, her legs barely supporting her. She wanted to look at Halfdan, to find some anchor in his eyes, but she forced herself to stare at the ground. Whatever was happening here, eye contact would only make it worse. Astrid stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice trembled with perfectly calibrated emotion. 3 nights ago, I discovered items missing from my personal belongings. A silver brooch, a length of fine linen, and a small pouch of coins. I suspected theft, but said nothing, hoping I had simply misplaced them. Liv's blood turned to ice. She had never touched Astrid's belongings, never even been near them without direct supervision. "Yesterday," Astrid continued, "I found these items hidden in the barn where the thralls sleep, specifically in the corner where this girl makes her bed." She gestured to Liv with something that looked like disappointment. I had hoped I was wrong. I wanted to believe that perhaps another thrall had placed them there, trying to cast blame on this poor creature. But then I remembered something else. She paused, letting the silence build. The crowd leaned in, hungry for the next revelation. I remembered how my betrothed had defended this thrall in the hall, how he spoke of her with unusual passion, how he visited her in the barn late at night. Astrid's voice broke convincingly. "I believe she stole from me not for her own gain, but as payment demanded by Halfdan. Payment for services rendered." The accusation hit Liv like a physical blow. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Astrid had just accused Halfdan of not only theft, but of using a thrall sexually and forcing her to steal to cover his debts. It was masterful in its cruelty. It destroyed both of them while making Astrid the sympathetic victim. "That's a lie," Halfdan's voice roared across the assembly. "I never asked her to steal anything. I never touched her. This is Astrid's revenge for being challenged in the hall." "Silence!" Torstein's command cracked like a whip. "You are accused, not accuser. You will speak only when given permission." Halfdan strained against his bonds, his face flushed with fury and desperation. "Father, you know this isn't true. You know what Astrid is doing." "What I know," Torstein said, and his voice was colder than the fjord in winter, "is that you have brought nothing but shame to this family since your return. What I know is that you have shown inappropriate interest in a thrall, defending her against your betrothed, visiting her in secret, and now that thrall is found with stolen goods in her possession." He turned to address the full assembly. "The evidence suggests theft and conspiracy. The thrall stole from the Lady Astrid, likely at the instruction or encouragement of my son, who has proven himself lacking in judgment and honor." "Search her," someone called from the crowd. "Search the thrall. See if she carries the goods on her now." 2 women stepped forward, rough hands patting down Liv's worn dress, checking the few possessions she kept tied in a cloth bundle. They found nothing, of course, because she had stolen nothing, but that didn't matter. The items had been found in her sleeping area. That was evidence enough. One of the law speakers, an old man named Kjell, who knew every rule and precedent, cleared his throat. "The law is clear. Theft from a free person by a thrall is punishable by death. However, if the thrall can prove they were coerced by a free person, that person shares the punishment." "I coerced no one," Halfdan said desperately. "This is a fabrication. Astrid planted those items herself to punish me for defending the girl." Astrid's eyes widened with perfectly performed hurt. "Why would I destroy my own betrothal? Ruin my own reputation by associating with such scandal? I gain nothing from this except pain and humiliation." She was good, so terribly good at this. Every word, every expression, designed to make her the wrong party while condemning both Halfdan and Liv. Thorstein stood from his seat, and the weight of his judgment pressed down on the assembly like a physical thing. My son has lost his way. Grief and shame have twisted his mind. But that does not excuse conspiracy to theft, and it does not excuse the thrall's crime. Please, Liv found herself speaking, the word torn from her throat. I stole nothing. I swear by all the gods I am innocent. The gods do not listen to thralls, Kjell said, not unkindly, just stating fact. Your oath has no weight in law. Liv looked at Halfdan then, finally, meeting his eyes across the assembly. She saw anguish there, rage, and beneath it all, something that looked like an apology. He had tried to save her, and instead, he had given Astrid the weapon she needed to destroy them both. The sentence for the thrall is death, Thorstein announced, to be carried out at sunset tomorrow. As for my son, Father, no. Halfdan's voice cracked. Please, she's innocent. If you must punish someone, punish me. Exile me, enslave me, but don't kill her for crimes. She didn't commit. You would take her punishment? Thorstein asked, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. Yes, Halfdan said immediately. I invoke the old right. I will stand for her crime. Let me take her place. The assembly erupted in shocked whispers. The old right was rarely invoked, a tradition from ancient times when a free person could accept punishment on behalf of another by becoming legally responsible for them. It was usually used for family. Members are sworn brothers, never for a thrall. If you invoke that right, Kjell said slowly, you become responsible for all her debts, all her crimes, past and future. You essentially claim her as yours, tied to you as if by blood, and you accept her punishment as your own. I understand, Halfdan said, and I claim that right now, before this assembly and the gods. Thorstein looked at his son for a long moment, and something passed between them that Liv couldn't read. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with finality. Very well. By claiming the old right, you spare the thrall's life, but you cannot spare yourself. You are hereby stripped of your inheritance, your position as my son, and your place in this household. You and the thrall both will be exiled, cast out from this community at dawn. If either of you returns, the death sentence will be carried out immediately. They gave them nothing. No food, no weapons, no warm clothes beyond what they already wore. Exile meant survival was your own problem, and if you died in the wilderness, well, that was judgment from the gods. Liv stood at the edge of the village as dawn broke over the fjord, the sky bruised purple and orange. Beside her, Halfdan adjusted the thin cloak someone had thrown at him, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. His mother had come to say goodbye, tears streaming down her face, pressing a small pouch into his hands before his father's men pulled her away. Bjorn had watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. Astrid hadn't come at all. She had won, after all. Why witness the aftermath? You should hate me, Liv said quietly, watching the sun climb higher. I've destroyed your life. You didn't destroy anything, Halfdan replied, his voice rough from the cold night in the barn where they'd been kept under guard. I made my choice, and I'd make it again. Why? The question burst out of her, desperate and confused. Why would you give up everything for someone? Like me? I'm nothing. No family, no value, nothing worth this sacrifice. He turned to face her fully, and even with his bruised face and exhausted eyes, there was something fierce in his expression. You keep saying you're nothing, but every time you say it, you're repeating their lie. The lie that some lives matter more than others, that power and position determine worth. He shook his head. I believed that lie too. Believed that surviving when my brother died made me worthless. That shame defined me. But you know what I learned watching you? Liv couldn't speak, her throat tight with emotion. I learned that dignity isn't something given by position or birth. It's something you carry inside yourself. You've been treated as less than human your entire life, and yet you wake up every morning and keep going. You work harder than anyone. You endure cruelty without becoming cruel yourself. That's not nothing, Liv. That's everything. Tears burned hot trails down her frozen cheeks. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever suggested that her existence had value beyond the work her hands could do. We're going to die out there, she whispered. Winter's coming. We have nothing. Then we die free, Halfdan said simply. And honestly, that sounds better than living in that hall, watching them slowly crush whatever humanity I had left. A warrior approached, the same grim-faced man who had summoned Liv to the thing. It's time. Head north, away from the trade. Routes. If you're seen near any Allied settlements, word will reach the Jarl, and the death sentence will be reinstated. North meant wilderness, forests thick enough to get lost in, mountains that could kill you with cold, and settlements so remote they followed their own laws. It was also the direction least likely to lead to quick death, which Liv supposed was a mercy of sorts. They walked in silence for the first hour, the village disappearing behind them as they climbed into the hills. Liv's thin shoes were already soaked through from snow, her feet numb. Halfdan fared better with his boots, but she could see him favoring his left side where his father's beating had left ribs bruised or broken. What was in the pouch? Liv asked finally, needing to break the oppressive silence. The one your mother gave you? Halfdan pulled it from inside his tunic, opening it carefully. Inside were 3 things: a small knife, a handful of dried fish, and a piece of amber carved into the shape of Thor's hammer. The knife and fish will help us survive a few days. The amber, his voice caught. The amber was my brother's. My mother must have kept it after he died. The weight of that gesture settled over them both. Helga had given her exiled son the only piece of her dead son she had left. It was forgiveness and blessing wrapped together, defying her husband's judgment in the only way she could. By midday, they reached a small stream, partially frozen. Halfdan used the knife to break through the ice, and they drank desperately, the water so cold it made their teeth ache. They shared one piece of the dried fish, making it last, knowing the rest needed to be rationed carefully. There's a settlement, Halfdan said, studying the landscape. Maybe 2 days north of here, not aligned with my father, but not friendly either. If we can reach it, we might find work, or at least shelter through the worst of winter. They'll take one look at me and know I'm a runaway thrall, Liv said. And you look like exactly what you are, a disgraced warrior. Then we lie. He met her eyes. We say we're married, that we're traveling to join your family in the north, that I was injured in a farming accident, not a fight. Whatever story keeps us alive. Married. The word hung between them, strange and impossible. 3 weeks ago, Liv had been invisible. Now she was supposedly wife to a Jarl's son. The absurdity almost made her laugh. They walked until darkness forced them to stop. Halfdan found a small cave, barely more than an overhang, but it blocked the wind. They huddled together for warmth, their backs against cold stone, watching their breath form clouds in the darkness. I'm scared, Liv admitted quietly. Me too. His admission surprised her. Warriors weren't supposed to admit fear, but then Halfdan wasn't really a warrior anymore. He was just a man trying to survive with a woman he'd sacrificed everything to save. Do you regret it? She asked. Your choice? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, ask me again when we're not freezing to death in a cave. Despite everything, Liv laughed. It was a small sound, quickly swallowed by the darkness, but it felt like rebellion, like proof that they were still alive, still human, still capable of finding something beyond despair. Halfdan shifted beside her, and she felt his arm move around her shoulders, pulling her closer against the cold. It wasn't romantic. It was survival. 2 bodies sharing heat in a world determined to freeze them out. But it was also something else. Recognition, partnership. 2 people who had been invisible in different ways, now seeing each other with a clarity that most people never achieved. Liv, Halfdan said softly. his breath warm against her hair. "Whatever happens, whatever comes next, I need you to know something." "What?" "You were worth it. You are worth it. Don't ever let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise." She turned her face into his shoulder, letting the tears come silently. They weren't tears of sadness exactly. They were tears of something breaking open inside her. Some wall she'd built to survive her life of invisibility finally crumbling, now that someone had breached it. Outside their small cave, the wind howled through the mountains. Winter was coming, and they had almost nothing to face it with. They might die in these hills, two exiles frozen together in the darkness. But they would die seen. They would die mattering to each other. And somehow, sitting in that freezing cave with a disgraced warrior's arm around her shoulders, Liv felt richer than she ever had sleeping in a warm barn as a thrall. Because for the first time in her 19 years, someone had looked at her and decided she was worth risking everything for. That knowledge, that impossible gift, would have to be enough to carry them through whatever came next. They nearly died on the third day. The storm came without warning, snow falling so thick Liv couldn't see Halfdan walking 3 steps ahead of her. The wind cut through their thin clothes like knives, and the cold wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. It was the kind of cold that made you want to lie down and sleep, and Liv knew enough to understand that sleep meant death. Halfdan collapsed first. One moment he was pushing forward through knee-deep snow, the next he was on his hands and knees, his body shaking violently. Liv dragged him under. A cluster of pine trees, their branches heavy with snow providing minimal shelter. His lips were blue, his eyes unfocused. "Stay awake," she begged, slapping his face with her numb hands. "Halfdan, stay awake." But his eyes kept sliding closed, his breathing shallow. Liv looked around desperately, knowing she had only minutes to do something, anything. Her own body was shutting down, hypothermia making her thoughts slow and muddled. Then she saw it, a thin trail of smoke rising in the distance, barely visible through the storm. She couldn't carry Halfdan. He was too heavy and she was too weak. But she could drag him. She grabbed him under the arms and pulled, her feet sliding in the snow, her muscles screaming in protest. Every few steps she fell, landing hard in the frozen drifts. But she got up. She always got up. The smoke came from a tiny hut, barely more than a shelter for shepherds during summer months. Liv kicked the door open and pulled Halfdan inside, collapsing beside him. On the dirt floor, there was a fire pit in the center, still smoking from whoever had been here before. With trembling fingers that barely functioned, Liv fed the dying embers with twigs and bark from the woodpile stacked against the wall. The fire caught, grew, filled the small space with blessed heat. She stripped off Halfdan's wet clothes, then her own, hanging them near the fire to dry. This wasn't about modesty. This was about survival. She pressed her body against his, sharing what little warmth she had, rubbing his arms and legs to force blood back into his extremities. "Don't you dare die," she whispered fiercely against his chest. "Don't you dare give up everything just to die in a shepherd's hut. I won't allow it." Hours passed. The storm raged outside while Liv kept the fire burning and Halfdan's body warm. Slowly, painfully, color returned to his face. His breathing deepened. When his eyes finally opened, they were clear again, focused on her face hovering above his. "You saved me," he said, his voice hoarse. "You saved me first," Liv replied. "I was just returning the favor." A ghost of a smile touched his cracked lips. "I think we're even now." They stayed in the hut for 2 days while the storm passed and their strength returned. They found supplies left by shepherds, dried meat, grain, even a thick wool blanket. Halfdan's ribs were badly bruised, but not broken. Liv's feet were frostbitten, but not severely. They had been lucky, impossibly lucky. On the third morning, the sun emerged, turning the snow-covered landscape into something almost beautiful. They packed what supplies the shepherds could spare to repay their use of the shelter and continued north. The settlement Halfdan had mentioned appeared on the 5th day. It was small, maybe 30 buildings clustered around a central longhouse, surrounded by farmland now buried under snow. They approached cautiously, Halfdan's arm around Liv's waist, playing the role of married travelers. The Jarl of E. This settlement was a woman named Sigrid. Her hair gray and her eyes sharp as she assessed the two half-frozen strangers who appeared at her door. "You look like trouble." "We're just travelers," Halfdan said, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "My wife and I are heading north to join her family. But winter caught us unprepared. We can work for food and shelter. I'm good with my hands, and she's a skilled weaver." Liv had never woven anything in her life, but she kept her face neutral. Sigrid studied them for a long moment. "You're running from something." It wasn't a question. Halfdan's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Liv stepped forward. "We're running from a life that didn't value either of us. From people who decided our worth based on mistakes and circumstances beyond our control. If that makes us criminals in your eyes, we'll move on. But we're not thieves. We're not violent. We're just trying to survive." Something shifted in Sigrid's expression. She looked at Liv with the kind of assessment that actually saw her, not just dismissed her. "The weaving house needs workers. The pay is minimal, but it includes shelter and food. You'll work from dawn until dusk, and if I catch either of you stealing or causing problems, I'll throw you out myself. Understood?" They both nodded, not trusting their voices. That was 8 months ago. Now, Liv sat at a loom in the weaving house, her fingers moving with practiced ease through patterns she had learned through observation and repetition. The other women had been suspicious at first, but gradually they had accepted her. Some even sought her company during meals. Halfdan worked with the blacksmith, his natural intelligence and willingness to learn, making him valuable, despite his lack of formal training. The scar on his face had faded to a thin white line, and something in his eyes had healed too. He no longer carried himself like a man crushed by shame. They lived in a small hut on the edge of the settlement, barely more than one room with a fire pit and sleeping platform, but it was theirs. No one ordered them around, no one treated them as less than human. They were just Halfdan and Liv, the married couple who worked hard and kept to themselves. Except they weren't actually married. That fiction had become complicated as months passed, and their relationship remained chaste, practical. Two people sharing space, but not intimacy. Until 3 weeks ago, when Liv had woken from a nightmare, gasping and shaking, and Halfdan had held her until dawn, whispering that she was safe, she was real, she mattered. Something had shifted that night. A boundary crossed not through passion, but through genuine care. Now, as Liv worked the loom, she saw Halfdan approaching through the window, his face flushed from the forge, carrying something wrapped in cloth. Her heart did a strange flip in her chest, a sensation she had only recently begun to recognize as happiness. He entered the weaving house, nodding respectfully to the other women, and approached Liv. "Can you step outside for a moment?" Curious, she set aside her work and followed him into the cool spring air. The snow had finally melted, revealing earth ready for planting. A whole year had passed since their exile, a year of survival that had somehow transformed into something like a life. Halfdan unwrapped the cloth, revealing a simple silver band. "I made this," he said, his voice uncertain in a way she rarely heard anymore. "I know we're already pretending to be married, but I thought maybe we could stop pretending. Maybe we could make it real." Liv stared at the ring, emotions crashing through her like waves. "You don't have to do this out of obligation." "It's not obligation." He took her scarred, work-roughened hand in his. "Liv, you're the bravest person I've ever known. You saved my life in that storm. But more than that, you saved my life by showing me what real worth looks like. Not position or power or glory in battle. Just the quiet courage of getting up every day and choosing to keep going. I want to spend my life with you. Not because I feel guilty, not because we're playing roles, but because I choose you. The way you chose to drag me through a blizzard instead of leaving me to die." Halfdan lost everything the world told him mattered. His inheritance, his family, his name, his future. But in losing it all, he found the one thing that actually did matter, his humanity. And Liv, who spent 19 years believing she was nothing, discovered that being seen by one person who truly values you is worth more than being ignored by thousands. Their story asks us a question we can't escape. What defines worth? Is it the position we're born into, the power we accumulate, the approval we chase? Or is it something deeper, something that lives in the quiet moments when we choose compassion over convenience, when we stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, even when it costs us everything? Think about your own life for just a moment. How many people do you pass each day without really seeing them? How many times have you stayed silent when speaking up would have cost you something? Halfdan and Liv's story isn't just about Vikings and thralls and ancient customs. It's about every person who's ever felt invisible, every act of courage that goes unnoticed, every choice between what's easy and what's right. Their love didn't come from passion or destiny. It came from recognition, from one broken soul looking at another and saying, "You matter, your life has value, and I will prove it, even if it destroys me." So here's the real question. Would you have done what Halfdan did? Would you risk everything for someone society tells you is worthless? Or would you have stayed silent, protected yourself, chosen survival over principle? There's no wrong answer. But the fact that you're asking yourself that question right now means their story did what it was supposed to do. It made you think. It made you feel. It reminded you that worth isn't given by the world. It's recognized by those brave enough to look past what everyone else sees. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about value and sacrifice and what it means to truly see another person, please share it. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel, because stories like this need to be told, and people like Halfdan and Liv, the invisible ones fighting to be seen, they exist. In every time, every place, waiting for someone to notice them. Maybe that someone is you.